much for coming, and I'm so excited to talk to you today about FlutterFlow. So Paris is one of my favorite cities to visit, and I already have seen a lot of familiar faces here, so I look forward to connecting with you all throughout the day. I'm Leigha, and I've been involved in the Flutter community for a couple of years now. I was previously one of the product managers for Flutter over at Google, and now I'm leading up product and developer relations at FlutterFlow. So I joined the FlutterFlow team about 3 months ago, and I was really excited about FlutterFlow's company mission, which is to help the world build great products. And I was excited about this mission because to me, this means democratizing access to building apps, giving everyone the ability to bring their ideas to life. And when I think about our product vision for the FlutterFlow platform, I think it's important to consider all the different ways that someone can build an app. So we kind of have different levels of abstraction. At the lowest level, you could be going and writing machine code, or maybe you're talking to graphics APIs, like writing shaders or hitting the Metal API on Apple's platforms. And then we have higher abstraction tools, going all the way to design tools like Figma. And most low-code tools are kind of high on that abstraction level. You don't have to worry about things like state management or rebuilding widgets or pages because the platform takes care of all of that for you. But of course, that has lots of trade-offs, like maybe it's hard to figure out what's going on. Everything's sort of a black box, so you lose control. And maybe you're sacrificing on your app's quality or certain features that you want to build into your application. So I'm considering FlutterFlow to be in its own category. I'm going to stop everyone from calling FlutterFlow a low-code tool, and instead we're going to start calling it a visual development environment. And the reason why I want to make this distinction is because I view it as lower abstraction compared to other low-code tools. So instead of kind of hiding everything that's going on under the hood, you're actually just having a slightly higher abstraction over the core Flutter framework. So taking care of like common workflows for you, but still giving you more granular control to do things like control your data flow, fine-tune performance, or even drop down to the code layer if you want to do something more custom. So when you're working in the FlutterFlow platform, you're working in this user interface that's over here on the left-hand side, where you're composing your pages, your widgets, you're styling them to your needs. And as you're clicking around in this user interface, FlutterFlow is tracking all of this in an intermediary format of your project or your app. And that is what's used to actually generate the Flutter code that you have access to. Now, for developers, our goal is really for FlutterFlow to make you faster. We want to make you more efficient so that you're focusing on the harder things in terms of development, and we'll take care of the easier things for you. And it's important to us that when you're using FlutterFlow, we're not asking you to sacrifice on your app quality or certain features. So we want to make sure it's flexible enough and that you can drop down to the code layer where necessary. And really, our goal here is to export a repository of Flutter code that looks like something you would write yourself. So our goal is really to make sure that the generated code is going to follow Dart and Flutter best practices as much as possible. And I put this little asterisk here because I know that best practices is something that is often debated. So really, we're focusing on best practices that we can all agree on. You know, things that we know have a really sizable impact on performance or code usability and readability. And one of the things that also makes FlutterFlow different from other low-code tools is that you can see the code as you're going, and you can always export the code and you own it. So this is your intellectual property. If you feel like FlutterFlow is slowing you down, you can export the code and just continue writing it as you would any other Flutter app. So that was kind of an overview of FlutterFlow. But now I want to talk a little bit more about the anatomy of a Flutter project when it comes out of FlutterFlow. So first, let's talk about the anatomy of a Flutter app itself. And if you've used Flutter before, you know that Flutter is mostly composed of widgets. So we have widgets all the way down. We start with a widget that represents our entire app, and then we might have a widget that represents a certain page. Within that page, we can have a widget that represents a layout, and then we might have more atomic widgets like buttons or text that are composed within these layouts. And to style these different widgets, we use like style constants or the theme object to have a consistent design. Besides using widgets that are built into the framework, like your column, your button, your text, you might also create your own widget classes. And these can be things that are more higher level design system components, like dialogues that meet your own branding. Or it could be something more custom, like maybe you want to go even lower level to use custom paint, or even drop down to like the native layer to do something really crazy. So when you're working in FlutterFlow, we have really similar classes that are exposed. Instead of creating a widget called My App, you create an app by creating a new project in FlutterFlow. And when you want to create pages, you go and create a page. And then we have built-in widgets, and these are the same things that you would have access to in the material library or the Flutter framework, like buttons and texts and layout widgets. And we also offer the ability to create custom widgets or components, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And just like when you're working in Flutter, writing code by hand, you can create a design system or a theme class that has different colors and text styles and things like that. Okay, so I wanted to do a lot of live demos, but I got scared last night when folks were talking about the Wi-Fi being a little unstable. So lots of screenshots to come. But when you log into the FlutterFlow platform, you see this builder interface. And on the left-hand side, I've already added a page. So this is like a sample e-commerce app. And this is my product detail page. It tells me all the information about my product, and it allows my user to add that product to their cart. So on the left-hand side, you can see the page selector up at the top. That's where I select what page I'm currently viewing. On the bottom, I can see the widget tree. So these are the widgets that are included in the build method of that page. And on the right-hand side, I can configure different widget properties. So right now, I'm selecting just my page class itself. So these are properties that are mostly tied to the scaffold of the page. Now I can go ahead and add different widgets to the widget tree of the page. You can see this modal that's opened up over here. And this is where you see those built-in widgets that I was talking about before. Layout widgets, atomic widgets like form elements, buttons, text, all that kind of good stuff. And I've already set up a design system here. As you can see, there's a light mode and dark mode, which I didn't really change because I was in a rush. But those are all my text styles and my color styles. And those can be used in the properties of the individual widgets, either on my page level or in the individual widgets on the widget tree. So now let's take a look at the generated code. And like I said, one of the things I really love about FlutterFlow is you always have access to the code. So there's this part in the FlutterFlow platform where I can hop over and see the code as I'm building. And one thing you'll note when I go to my product detail page, and I have my page open on the right-hand side, which makes it really nice to like click on a button and see specifically the code for that button and so on. But you'll notice the widget and the model toggle at the top. And this is where I'm able to have separation of UI and the data model. So when FlutterFlow generates the code for you for things like pages and components, it generates two classes. One to hold the data model, and one to hold the UI layer. So first, I'm going to talk about the UI layer. So taking a closer look at my pages widget code, you can see that pages in FlutterFlow are just widgets, right? Just like in Flutter. Only we make them into this different object because we want to take care of a lot of the annoying stuff for you. Like we know pages are going to have a scaffold, and we know you're probably want to do routing. So we set up all the routing for your pages for you using GoRouter. And one thing I hear when I talk to users about their concerns when using FlutterFlow is that FlutterFlow generates a lot of code. And I do agree with you. When I look at the code generated by FlutterFlow, at first it's a bit overwhelming. You often see like a pretty long widget tree. But as you go in and you start digging deeper, a lot of what I've realized is that FlutterFlow is taking care of kind of like the fine-tuning of your app for you. So this is one example where we have a setting that allows you to hide keyboard on tap for certain pages, and this is enabled by default. And what you'll see is this little bit of code for the gesture detector returned in the build method for every page. Basically, all this says is if the keyboard is open and someone taps the page, dismiss the keyboard. And it makes your app feel more natural. So aside from that, we of course have our scaffold, and then we have all the widgets that we've added to our widget tree. And most of these widgets are going to be just things that are built into the Flutter platform itself. So for example, app bar is just the app bar widget from the material library. But you'll also notice some of these like FlutterFlow or FF custom classes that we've included in the generated code. And again, we've done this to try to take care of the stuff that we think you're going to want to do, but is sometimes annoying to do in code, or maybe not built directly into the Flutter framework. So one example is customizing material components. We know that sometimes this is a little bit difficult to do, so we've created our own classes for a lot of these common UI elements so that they better match your own design system. And back to that theming that I was mentioning before. I've already set up my theme in FlutterFlow. I've set up my text styles and my colors. And that creates a FlutterFlow theme object. So this is a class that we've, again, defined so that we handle things like light mode and dark mode for you, and you don't even have to worry about it. But in the generated code, you'll see our FlutterFlow theme object being called in the same way that the material theme class would be used. All right, so that was pages and a little bit of how we generate code in general. Now let's talk about creating components. So when I first created this page, I have these 3 different kind of like option buttons on my page to do things like select my size, my color, the quantity of the item that I want to add to cart. And at first, I just added these to my page's widget tree. But there's lots of things that I'm repeating here, like the styling, the sizing of the container, and I don't want to repeat myself. So instead of having these 3 highlighted bits as their own widgets on the widget tree, I can click that button all the way over to the right-hand side to create a component from the widget tree. And when I create a component, this just creates a new class in the generated code. So it creates a new widget class, which I'll show in a second. Now on the left-hand side, you can see that instead of having all that code that I had before, I just have 3 different widgets. And those are instances of this new product option class that I've created. And when I create this class, which you can see in the top right-hand corner, I can pass in things like parameters. So in my case, I just created an option type enum variable, and I'm passing that in as a parameter. And then when I add that widget to my widget tree, I can configure what the parameter needs to be when it's being passed in. OK, so that's what it looked like in FlutterFlow. Now hopping over to the generated code, we can see that these components are also just widgets, right? Everything is a widget. And these are more granular things like the button we just showed. So we don't need a scaffold, and we won't set up routing for you. Instead, this just is a stateful widget. And earlier I mentioned that sometimes you want to create custom widgets, and those custom widgets in Flutter might be classes like we just showed that are just a composition of classes coming from the framework. Or they might be something where you want to go even lower and access like custom paint, or maybe use some widgets from a different library. And in that case, you can drop down to the code layer in FlutterFlow. And we call these just custom widgets. So you define the code for what you want your custom widget to be. You can pass in any parameters, and you can also specify a pub/spec dependency. All right, so that was an overview on the widget layer, but now let's talk about that data model layer. And of course, if we're talking about data model, we probably need to talk about state management. So in FlutterFlow, we have 3 different types of state management variables, or state variables, rather. We have our app state variable. And in my example of an e-commerce app, I might create a cart app state variable, because this needs to be persisted across my different pages. I might need to interact with it from the product detail page to add an item to my cart, and then I might have a checkout page that also needs to access this data. Then we have the page state variable, and this is just shared within the page itself. So an example of this might be the rating of the product that I'm looking at on the product detail page. And then I have my component state. So this is a state variable that's just confined to the component. So one example of this might be in that product option component I created. Maybe I want a state variable that tells me if it's selected, so I can add a border or show some selected state. OK, so how do we do this in FlutterFlow? Here I'm on my page that I showed you before, my product detail page, and I've created a state variable, which is what you can see over on the right-hand side where it says local page state variable. I've created the rating state variable to store the rating of my product. And now I can use that variable in the widget properties. So for example, setting the text string value of the text widget that's on this page. So now heading over to the generated code, before I showed you what the widget layer looked like for the page, now I want to show you what that data model layer looks like. So you'll see a separate class for handling the model. And in this class, first I'm showing the state variables that I've created. Now I just showed you rating, but I've also created some other state variables that are stored at my page for what the selected color of the item is, what the selected quantity is, and what the selected size. And I didn't point it out before, but that class that I just showed actually extends a base FlutterFlow model class. And this basically handles the initialization of state and some disposal methods for you. And under the hood, we're using provider to make the model available to other parts of the widget tree. What you'll also notice if we go back to that product detail page model class is that aside from declaring my state variables that are stored at the page level, I'm also going to instantiate the model for any components that are used in the page itself. So the reason why FlutterFlow does this is because there are often lots of business cases where you want the page to have access to state variables in its children. So in this example, each one of my 3 components has a component state called isSelected, like we mentioned before, which tells me if that button is in the selected state. So if I'm working on my page and I want to set a widget property, I can use that variable isSelected from any of those widgets, or components rather, to set the widget property. And I won't go into too much detail of different use cases for this right now, but this comes in really handy if you're creating a page that's like a form, for example, where you really need to know what the selected value of every form is. OK, so that was a little bit about the page model. Now let's talk about a specific use case where I want to update the page state from a component. So in my case, I'm storing the selected size, selected quantity, selected color of the item as state variables like I showed before. And when a user is interacting with one of these components, I need to use their interaction to update that state variable. For example, change the size of the selected item. So the way I'm going to do this in FlutterFlow is I can specify an action as a parameter for my component. And an action in FlutterFlow is basically a function. So all I'm saying is now my size option or product option component or widget class is now going to have the option to take in a callback function as a parameter. So I set that at the component level, I define a parameter, and then when I'm instantiating that class, I can pass in the callback function to update my page state. So if I head back to the generated code, I can see that now I'm looking at my product option widget. That's that component that I created that's reusable for my selecting size, color, and quantity. And now there's another parameter that's added as an input, and it's a function. And when I was showing it on the last slide, I didn't point it out, but actually the function that I was passing in has its own parameters, option type and selected size. So this is a callback that can now be called by my component to update that state variable. And to actually define what that function is, to pass it into my class, I can use, again, what's called an action in FlutterFlow. So I've created what's called a page action block, which is essentially just a function that is scoped to the page level. And here I've configured the logic of this function, which in this case is just using a condition to check what type of button it is. Is it the one for selecting size? Is it the one for selecting color? And it updates the state variable according to what type of option it was. OK, so that was me configuring my function in FlutterFlow. Now, if I look at the generated code, this function has been added to my pages model because I scoped it to be at the page level. And this is pretty simple. It's basically just a function that has a condition and then sets the state. So now if I want to actually execute that callback in my component itself, I open up the component in FlutterFlow, and I specify when that function should be called. So the component has the function because it was a parameter, and now the component needs to call that function. And in this case, I'm using the size as an option. So when someone changes the size dropdown, as soon as they change that dropdown option, the callback will be executed. And just to kind of show you what this looks like under the hood, if I open up my data model for the component that's generated, I can see that state fields for different widgets that are used in that component are also declared in this model. So for example, a form field controller was automatically added because I used the dropdown widget inside of my component. And then we simply see the callback executed when the dropdown is selected. Cool. So that was page and component states, but there's one other state variable that's app state. And this is when I want to share a variable across different pages, like cart, which I mentioned before. So the way I would do this in FlutterFlow is I want to create a cart state variable, which I can show here in that app state image down below. But I actually want this to be a custom data type, right? Because my cart has lots of different attributes, like the cart ID or the items that are in that cart. So what I've done first is I've created a cart data type. And that's essentially just a struct, right? And that's what I'm showing right over here in this left-hand corner. So I've created my cart struct, and I've created an app state variable that is of type cart struct. And in the generated code, I can see this come to life. So the way FlutterFlow handles app state is we have one FlutterFlow app state class, FFAppState, which extends change notifier. Essentially, it exposes some getters and setters for the different app state variables. And like I mentioned before, we're using this custom data type, which you can see over here. I won't show the definition, but this is its own class that's stored in your code base as well. And then when I actually want to use this app state variable, for example, in some cart checkout page, that cart's widget will include context.watch to watch the FlutterFlow app state class. Now, I do want to say that we think there's room for improvement here. Right now, this is kind of one giant app state class, and we're working on breaking it up into smaller modules and having more granular watching, so you're not watching the entire class. But it's still a pretty good start, I think. And one cool thing I wanted to point out is that in FlutterFlow, what you can do is something called dynamically generate children. So on the right-hand side, I've actually created a list view that just dynamically generates one child for each item in my cart. And then it uses my cart item component to show what the item should look like. And in the generated code, all this looks like is a list view builder where I'm iterating through each item in my cart. All right, so that was state management. And now I want to talk very briefly about connecting to the backend. So you might have lots of ways of managing your backend. Maybe you have different databases. Maybe you're using Firestore or SQL database. And we offer pretty good options to connect to those. But we also have this ability to just connect to any API. So in FlutterFlow, I can create an API call. One nice thing is that you can upload an API spec, like an open API file, to just automatically handle this for you. But in my example, I've created an API that just calls this URL to get the ratings of my product. And in the generated code, we actually have a couple of different classes that we create on our own to use to configure this API. So the first one is the API call options class, and this just configures the details of an API call. And it uses this equitable package to easily cache the options, so we're not unnecessarily hitting your API. Then we have this API call response class, which of course makes the API call response easily consumable by the rest of your application. And then we have an API manager, which just manages the request creation, execution, response handling. And under the hood, it's mostly using the HTTP package. So those were the classes that are just generated by FlutterFlow to use in all API calls. But when you create an API call the way I did before, it will also create a class specific to that call. So in my case, I created an API to get my product ratings. So FlutterFlow has generated this getRatingCall class. In FlutterFlow, when I want to call that API, I can again go back to actions, which are essentially just functions, right? So up at the top, you can see the trigger, and I've set this to run when my page is loaded, specifically my product detail page. So when my product detail page first loads, then it's going to make this backend call, where I'm simply saying, make the backend call, use the getRatingCall that I've configured, and pass in any variables. In my case, I already created a query parameter variable called product ID. One nice thing is this kind of format makes it really easy to parse the response into a custom data type, which would be configured over on the right-hand side. And I can set different paths for how to respond in the case of a success or an error. And you can make this more granular, like responding to certain status codes or messages and showing something like a snack bar, or maybe just like setting the state to some specific value. In my case, I was just moving quickly, so I said, OK, if this worked, then just update my page state variable so that my cart or my rating state variable is refreshed with the results of the API call. Cool. So over in the generated code, I'm going back to my product details page widget code, so the UI layer. And I can see that this bit of code has been added. So in init state, when the page has actually loaded, then make a call using the class for my API configuration. And if you did something like handle errors or transform the result of the API call, all of that would show up here. Cool. So didn't have a ton of time today, so I was moving very quickly. And there's lots of stuff we didn't cover, like connecting to a database, configuring authentication, animations, navigation, localization. So much stuff to talk about. So I would love if you give FlutterFlow a try, and I'm very eager to get all of your feedback. And I did want to say that there's lots of things we're improving on. I recently wrote up a blog about our vision and roadmap, so feel free to take a look. But a big part of our roadmap is improving the architecture of apps generated with FlutterFlow. This is things like breaking up our app state into different modules, being more specific about only watching the variables that you need, making components more powerful in general so that you can create components wherever possible, and also just making it easier to debug, because I know that's just something that's in general difficult to do in low-code tools. Anyway, that's it. So I'm looking forward to hearing some questions.